Hello and welcome to the Metropolitan Playhouse for the Wednesday Alternative. We have an exciting program tonight which we hope will illuminate and explore some of the work we do here. Metropolitan is committed to bringing to light lost and forgotten works of the American past, illuminating history and reckoning with how we've gotten where we are. This also puts us in a unique position to explore and address diversity and inclusion in a thoughtful, artistic, and communal way. Tonight, in a forum we're calling The Past is Present, we'll do just that. I'm grateful and excited to have this group of people gathered to have this conversation. And before we dive in, I'd like to invite our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and what they do. And we will go in order of appearance, how I have it on my screen, starting with Melissa.
Hello, my name is Melissa Maxwell. I am an actor, writer, director, educator, motivational speaker. Spent most of my life freelancing. I am a company member and the co-associate artistic director of the Great River Shakespeare Festival, and I am also the director of professional development at the Stellar Adler Studio of Acting here in New York City.
Awesome, thank you so much. Next up is Linda.
Hi, I'm Linda Kurloff, and I am an actor, writer, director, and during the day I work as an assistant director.
Thank you very much. Next on my screen is Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex Rowe, and I am, like the others, a utilitarian theater maker, actor, director, and writer. For the past 20 years, I've been producing artistic director of Metropolitan Playhouse, whose mission and purpose Amanda described as well as I could, to explore America's theatrical heritage and past to shed insight on its present.
Thank you. Next, I have Diego.
Hi, my name is Diego Carvajal. I'm an actor, lawyer, and currently a consultant working for a boutique consulting firm. We focus on diversity and inclusion. Our clients run the gamut. We work with all sorts of industries, law firms, not-for-profits, and also with museums and other type of cultural institutions.
Thanks. And last, I have Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel Langton. I'm a freelance director, playwright, theater maker, and I also am the digital marketing associate at Classic Stage Company. So I work with classics in that realm, as well as directing classics and exploring classics and theater in general.
Awesome. Thank you all. And again, thank you so much for being here. I so appreciate you taking the time for us. So to begin, you've all kind of mentioned this in your introductions, how you have this relationship with voices of the past, but as you know, that's our wheelhouse. We value the voices of the past. So can you speak to what you personally see as the value in giving life and space to older works and historical voices?
I'd like to speak to that. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately is how vigorously there's been opposition to basic human stories being told about Black, brown, red, yellow Americans and American residents. And in the past, in the various forms of media. And when I think of organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and how some of their tenets were to basically rewrite history and depict slavery as a benevolent institution, to depict Confederate soldiers as heroes, and not tell the simple true story that slavery and their wanting to keep it going was what almost tore this country apart. So there's always been this understanding that we've got to control how the story of the white American is told in history books, in records, and on the airwaves, in movies and television. Others um, are given one side. They're the villain, they're the buffoon, they're the butt of the joke, you know, that kind of thing. And so I feel like it's important to give them their proper space today.
You know, history is important because if you don't know where you came from, you can't understand where you are. You know, and I think narrative is important. I think of my childhood, and I remember watching John Wayne stories that were really, you know, sort of shoved down our throat in terms of us and them, you know, the cowboys being the hero and the Indian being the villain. And if I can put it in today's times and how, you know, it took me a long time, I had to be an adult before I realized, no, the Indians were simply standing their ground. And they had every right to do so. You know, so it's who's controlling the narrative and to what purpose and end. And also the idea that only one group has contributed to history, I think is strange. I was doing a show, directing a show at a few years ago, and someone said, "Oh, please, I'm the only white actor in this otherwise black show." And I thought, what makes a show black? You know, is it the number of actors who are in it? Is it whether or not the playwright who's written it happens to be of color? You know, is it the ratio? So if there are 5 black actors and 1 white actor, does that make it black? What if they're white people talking about black subject matter? And I thought, why must it be other? It's an American story. So, you know, the fact that white European-centric shows are the gold standard and everything else must be categorized, I think needs to change.
In my mind, there's 2 things that are very, very important. One is a processing of trauma, because for so many people in this country, their voices have not been heard. The things that they are struggling with, they've been struggling with for centuries or decades. And oftentimes, not understanding where that comes from, not understanding, for example, that the recent string of attacks on Asian Americans, it's nothing new. There's a long history behind it. There's a long history related to racism, imperialism. There's a long history related to, you know, what happened with George Floyd, what happened with Amy Cooper in Central Park. There's a long history that's tied to the identity of this country. And so to the extent that we can explore that through works of art, I think is crucial, and it's really important. And not only is it important, but I think it's important in terms of being able to process the trauma that I think many people of color feel today.
I'm hearing, and what I really agree with is that these classic stories are a big part of us and our culture, whether we like it or not. And I think that there's worth exploring that because it is what perpetuates our work today. And I feel like, you know, you look at a lot of stories and they go back, we kind of repeat the same story over and over again as humans, where we like that sort of repetition. And we are in this cycle of repeating the same stories from the same, like, few white men kind of from the past. But that's not all that was out there. And I think it's really important to look at that and dissect what that narrative is, and also see what else was going on to bring that perspective into today.
We're talking, when we say these works, you know, are we talking about the canonical work or the familiar work or even the forgotten work that was mainstream and most produced, which is easiest to find, really? And that's something that I've become very, very familiar with producing at Metropolitan Playhouse, where we get all kinds of credit for doing plays that no one remembers, no one ever heard of. Where did you find this play? Well, they're not hard to find. You know, they were on the marquee productions in the 19th century, the 18th century, and up through the 20th century, certainly halfway through it. But they were all very much written for the powerful audience, the people who were going to Broadway or going to the larger theaters in the across the country. And so those are largely your conventional plays in their form and plays about the people who had the wealth and the power, and those are going to be, white society typically. So on the one hand, there's those, and I think everyone's addressed those in one way, but also you began to address what about the unheard voices from the past. And I don't know that we have to make every comment we make applicable to them separately, but I think it's really valuable to recognize that there are both the marginalized voices, the people who didn't get to tell their story or whose story was not even heard at the time or was heard in a very small community, and then the one that was the dominant story that continues to influence what we see, and finding those diversions, and finding the responses even in that past. And on the larger subject of it, I just want to throw in about the value of it. And maybe this applies whichever way you're looking. Alyssa Luria, who is an urban archaeologist and founder of Chrysalis Archaeological Consultants, had a wonderful quote I heard the other day where she said, having a well understood in the past is the best way to help build the future. And I think that's something that I've wanted Metropolitan to be committed to, is in whatever we produce, understanding better that past so that we can build the future. And
there's so much out there that in the past that reverberates with the present. There's so much that has been spoken about that is continuing to be spoken about today. And so I think that there's a clear answer to, is there a value in producing some of these plays that have to do with an issue that we're still tackling today? Absolutely. I think, however, to the plays that perhaps may not draw a parallel to today's society, perhaps, and I think, Alex, that's the point that you were raising. There are some plays that, rich people talking about money, is that something that is relevant today? It's interesting. I think to a certain extent, it depends on how you frame it. Is The Great Gatsby something that's relevant today? To a certain extent, when we're dealing with, such high income inequality in this country, it depends on how you frame it. I think that I think the value there is to spark a conversation. I think that the talkback has become not so much a nice thing that happens from time to time, but I think from what I'm seeing from a lot of theater is that the talkback has become a crucial part of this, because I think many people are looking to have a dialogue with theater and their current life in a way that we didn't really see before.
I guess I'm old school. I believe that, theater is as important as water and food and sex is to an individual. And I believe, as an actor, as a storyteller, my feeling has always been that acting and theater is the human of the study of human psychology. So I've never approached it as it's just a form of entertainment. I think that theater, should always in some way inform, educate, challenge. And for that very reason, I think then it is important to look at some of the plays from history. And let's face it, some plays wear better than others. Some plays you read and you say, this feels really outdated, and some are timeless. And so I think it's a case-by-case basis. And I think whatever you choose to do, though, it's really about why. Why now is the question, and what is its relevance to what is happening now.
I think that's like kind of the big misconception when it comes to putting on the classics, is like I feel like as a theater industry put on classics to get the most audience members in the house because everyone has heard of this play before. And so it's kind of that easy access point. But I think really to truly do the classics, you need to be looking at why, like Melissa, like you said, why are we doing this play now? Why does this play transcend time? What does the themes of this play back then mean today? And I think if you're not doing that with your classic work, then you're not giving it justice. And then really it's just doing theater for theater's sake, which I personally, as a theater artist, don't see as much value in, because I think theater has the value to really make you think and look into what we as humans do.
One thing I've understood more and more about theater is to me anyway, it's really not about telling the audience anything. The audience, I increasingly think, does not care what I think, about a play or about an issue that the play is about. And that's counterintuitive, I think, for people who have not directed. They think of the role of the director as a different one. I think the audience cares about what they think. And if the theater can start the conversation or pose a question in its exploration, it's not that it doesn't have a point of view or it's not an interpretation of the play, but ultimately I think we go on this journey and we say, here's what we found. What do you make of that?
The best theater doesn't tell you how you should feel about rich people talking about money. It just lets you see rich people talking about money, and then based on your history, your experiences, you will extrapolate from that what you need or want to at that time. And sometimes you will have a different opinion, or your opinions will be challenged. I mean, that's the hope of theater, is that it will start to get you to think differently or to understand something in a new way. And so, yes, I think the best theater is the kind of theater that doesn't pick a side or answer anything for you. It just poses something to you and allows you to then begin to think what you think about that.
May I ask a question in that regard? Outside of bad production that doesn't allow room for people to think about it, can you think of a play or a genre of play that you would just not produce now? Because it has to be a specific place. I mean, not the type of play that doesn't do what we're talking about, but is there a play or any group of plays or something you feel like, its perspective, the play, to do justice to the play, to present it in its own terms and let it live on its own, is so irrelevant or so dismissive or so wrong. I mean, wrong by your own ethical standards of affirmation or respect, that you feel, actually, I couldn't produce it because not only does it have no value, it's so unrelated or it is so hostile. And I'm not thinking either of, an overtly agitprop play that is, about the dismissal or colonial depredations or something like that. But can we imagine the plays that really should be forgotten, that there's no value in presenting them, or in fact it's counterproductive? And maybe that's too obvious or vague a question to even bother answering, but that's what occurs to me. As we say, everything opens up a question, and you invite people in. I wonder if there's some plays that no, you can't do it.
I don't know that this will always be the case, but I saw Native Son that was before it went to Broadway. I saw it at the Yale Rep, and I had a visceral reaction to it. I felt like, why do you think we need to do this play now, where there's this completely unsympathetic character, Bigger Thomas, as the lead. And at the end of the play, when they kill him, we go, thank goodness, when the police shot them. Personally, I could not do it. I feel like at the time that the story was being told, it was a window into the harsh realities of Black American life that white Americans hadn't seen or didn't understand. If you saw certain behaviors, why are they so angry? Why are they so hostile? Why is there crime? Then you sort of needed a way to understand, how could a character become like this, where he's so he kills this white woman, he who he's working for, and is harsh to his mom, his girlfriend. I can't even remember all the things, but there's not anything sympathetic about Bigger Thomas. And so in a world where Black people are being killed in the street, this was before George Floyd, but but those kinds of things have happened to the George Floyds of this world. And I was furious that Yale did it. I felt like, why do you think we need that now? There, in my opinion, there should be no Black male unsympathetic characters on stage right now, in my opinion. In any movies, in any stage, that's just how I feel. Because we're out here fighting for our lives just to get people to believe we're human.
And I might add, Linda, we are in the middle of the Chauvin trial right now. And remember that Chauvin is on trial, and yet they are still trying to dehumanize George Floyd and make him look like a Bigger Thomas in order for it to seem justified for what Chauvin did. So I hear you loudly and clearly. I would add to that, Alex, that, for me, I don't know. It would be a case by case. I mean, Linda just brought one that to our attention that I think is a great example. But I also, I would say there are lots that at face value might seem like they are outdated and should not be done. And I've heard argument that Taming of the Shrew should never be done again because it is so chauvinistic and anti-whatever. And yet I have seen and heard wonderful twists on it. I think it was a British production where the whole take on it was that it was the wear down of domestic abuse. And it's what happens when somebody just keeps tearing you down physically and mentally until you finally give in. And, and I thought, that's a new twist. I can see and understand that production. I've seen it, and where it's in terms of gender and switching gender. So I'm there. I think at first glance there are lots of titles that one might assume should never be done, and yet if we put our thinking caps on, there may be a new into them. And so
for me, it's not what you do, it's how it's done. And I think that the thing that was missing before was that many of these plays came from one perspective, and this was the perspective, and this was the dialogue. The dialogue was limited to, like, this is what it's going to be about. But now when you open up the dialogue, when you start asking, wait a minute, these characters that are viewed as villains, these characters that are viewed as sidekicks, these characters that are viewed as helpless, what if they're not? Or what were those people, what were those voices saying at the time?
I think that's my biggest problem when it comes to the classics. And Melissa, when you talked about Taming of the Shrew, and I remember seeing Kiss Me Kate when the revival came out, and I was just like, I'm so sick of having to take these awful stories that we had upheld and then let's find the twist to make it okay today. I'm but ultimately, can we just find a new story? And I'm not saying that there's not value in turning that story on its head. I'm just as a director, I feel that you need to uplift the playwright's words, but but what if the playwright's words are wrong? Then why am I looking at this piece anymore? And that's kind of how I feel about Taming of the Shrew. And again, I don't want to say a definitive, it should never be done. I do think the how you do it is important, but at the same time, I'm but can we just look at a different story? There's so many out there. For me, because I grew up on a lot of MGM classics as a kid. That was kind of my go-to. And every year we watch Easter Parade, and I was watching it again this year, and I'm This is a really problematic story that I have personal memories to of growing up watching to it. And so I go to that nostalgia and I'm able to then kind of ignore the impact of the story. And I feel like that's kind of how audiences feel with, you think of Oklahoma and all of these like big musicals that a lot of people have very close memories with. And then we can just kind of ignore the impact of the story. But I think that there's harm in that
I just want to
nostalgia.
draw a parallel to a play that was produced at the Metropolitan, which when I saw it, it was just such a visceral reaction on my part in a positive way, because it was a reflection of, Linda, what you just said. And it was a play called the Octa Rune. And the play, for people that are not familiar with it, dealt with someone who was white appearing, but because she was 1/8 Black, they considered her to be able to be sold as a slave. And in the play, there's this one line that's by this character. He's a Black character, and he's talking about how the last thing he wants to be is ungrateful. And he says it. He's like, the last thing I want to be is to be thought of as ungrateful, for the fact that, he's enslaved and he's given food and all this other stuff. And I remember watching that play, and I cried. I cried during the play because I thought, man, this is what internalized oppression looks like. This is how they get you. This is how, so many people of color, particularly Black Americans, are just worn down, and how slavery can be mental as well as physical.
Diego, I think like what you picked up off of that play, I would not have picked up on as a white woman, and therefore I should not be directing that play, because if the audience, I would be perpetuating a narrative that would be harmful, and I think that's like the sort of recognition when it comes to producing a play. You can't just think of the play as itself. You also have to think of the creative team and the audience and all these other levels that go into it.
To follow this train of who's in the room, have you found it in your circles that particular communities and particular environments lend themselves well to the production and the reception of these older works and older narratives?
Sometimes it's challenging. People want to see old plays, but sometimes the facts of a different era, like I played a character in State of the Union that was a Southern Democrat. And as a Black woman of that time, that would have meant I was like pro-slavery, the Democrats were, like far right-wingers now. And so it's problematic on a certain level, but then I thought, well, at any time, there is that Black American who wears their, Make America Great Again hat, and they're proud of it. And you feel like, why are you standing up for things that are best interest? But they don't see it that way. And so I think that's always going to be just the reality of being human. Some friends of mine came and saw that play, and one friend of mine was just so mad to see me playing this role that I was like, you need to calm down. This is one character, but he was like, she wouldn't have been a Black woman. Da, 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 da. I was like, I know, but they're trying to, revisit these works. That's complicated. There's no one way to do it. And so I don't know how everybody feels about it. I just have that one friend's perspective that was, he just felt like that play they shouldn't have done it that way, and whatever. I liked it though.
We had no regret casting you, Linda. And but I remember in the casting, we loved you. I was working with the director on it and thought that you captured the possibility of this character. And you said something about like what you said in the talk back about making it work. And what that was thinking about was, if you present actors problems, thinking about who's in the room and how do you do it, actors will solve the problem and they don't want to make more problems. They'll figure it out, or they won't accept the role. But so there is always this question about are you railroading, is the production company bullying in a way and making something, forcing people into positions that don't make sense, as your friend said. But I thought, for what it's worth, that your approach to the role made perfect sense of her and of her being in that position. And so the question of, was the role written for an African-American woman? No, it was 1945. It was not. Was she, when you say, was she pro-slavery? Well, she wasn't dealing with slavery. So, what her politics could have been, I felt like your performance made a very credible case for a woman of color married to a judge. She was married to a very white judge. One had to ask, okay, would that have been an accepted relationship? Could it have gone without comment? And the answer to that, I think, is no. And the play doesn't comment on it. So we are asking the audience to give some latitude. But once you accept that possibility, the performance of you as you, not you in whiteface or, transparent whiteface pretending, made perfect sense. But it was, I perfectly respect people saying, they've got problems with that and can't accept the play on those terms. Still, I was really glad that we presented it on those terms.
And I think going back to the question related to this in terms of what communities are more open to receiving this, well, I think it's no secret that the largest population that is of theater goers are white. And, the reason is that what we already said. I mean, so many of these plays speak to the white experiences from the white perspective. So many cultural institutions cater to the white experience, the white perspective. And now that's changing, that's slowly changing. But I think that when you think of all these old plays, I mean, that's what it was. As of now, to answer your question, Amanda, I think the communities that are more likely to be interested in these older plays are the communities that can see themselves in these old plays.
Going off of that, I personally believe that putting actors of color in traditionally white plays is a way to meet those white audiences with something they know and challenge them. Because unfortunately, that does get pushback sometimes when you put an actor of color in a traditionally white role, outside of the complexities of what that role actually is. Just of trying to think of an example of a main classic play, Juliet could never be black or something like that, which is there's absolutely nothing in the text that says one way or another. Or I remember in London, I saw an all black version of Hamlet and they're like, oh, they're just doing that to be cool. And I'm like, no, there's so much more happening here. And the fact that a predominantly white audience is now seeing a show that they thought was only about them, now having new people in it, I think that is challenging. I think that's a very teeny tiny step for a very long, long way. But I think that is one thing.
There's a part of me that doesn't feel like I need to see an all-black Cat on a Hot Tin Roof or an all-black fill in your favorite dead white play right here. Because again, it goes back to historically all of the other voices that have been frozen out of this dialogue. And, historically, white theaters get far more money in grants to do black theater than black theater companies to do their own work. And so before I see an all-black Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, I'd rather see a story of a narrative to those people, to their heritage.
We don't want to dress up like white people and tell white stories. We want to tell our stories, and our stories are relevant, and our stories are important, and our stories make up part of the American story. And I think that that's crucial. When those conversations are being had, I often hear from many cultural institutions, because you see this in the art world as well, and you see this in film. Well, we don't want to isolate our white audiences, because we want to continue to keep our white audiences as part of this. And what's interesting about that is that there's an assumption that if you begin to tell stories that do not center white America, or do not center a certain group of people, then there's going to be a loss of interest. And I don't believe that's true. I don't think that's true at all, because many people of color, we've been seeing white stories and we've been captivated by them for a long time. So I think the same is true otherwise. And so I do think that oftentimes it's unfortunate that that's where the conversation goes. Well, we don't want to isolate certain people, and I don't think you will. But I will also say that to the extent that those voices are not out there, because for such a long time, because of systemic racism, people of color have not had the opportunity to have their plays produced. And maybe there's a lot of plays out there that have been written, but they kind of went by the wayside because there was no funding and there was no, support behind that. I think that's difficult. That is difficult. And so I think when it comes to producing old plays where, those voices are not there, having a dialogue of how we incorporate those voices in there is difficult, but I think there's ways to do that. And I think, Linda, you gave a good example, and that's a good place maybe to begin casting. But maybe, there's some writers out there that are thinking about, plays, what would these voices be saying? Maybe we have to think about, writers that are writing in that today, but writing about that time with, documentation from that time, or perhaps firsthand data from that time about, what these voices could be talking about.
I think we might be remiss if we, in this conversation about moments and where we've been and where we are, if we didn't talk about where we are, in terms of we are in a pandemic and we are seeing each other virtually, and we are in the midst of this massive social movement that has, so many implications for what we do and what we don't do. And I'm curious to know if there are insights that have come out of any of these really significant historical events that we're all facing.
I think theaters are really scared right now because we haven't had an income in over a year. And artists haven't had an income in over a year. And as I'm seeing theaters start to reopen, while I am so grateful we are finally having these conversations that are way long overdue, I am so worried that we are slipping back into our old habits in order to get our theaters back. Like, I'm looking at what are the shows that have been popping up in the streets, and they're all like big celebrity names. And I think that there is this feeling that we need to rush to get back to normal. And I am very wary that we are missing the point of why the world needs theater right now. Is because of all the things, Linda, that you've just said so eloquently. That being said, at the same time, what I really think this pandemic has done is it has decentralized theater from New York and has brought it all across the country. And I actually think that might spark more community theater in other places that we can have more access to, which I think could really help us as theaters be more about that discussion with the audience. I think you can do that more when we're not centralized around this one city with this one group of people that are really creating the stories.
So to jump off that, I think what's interesting about this is that I don't see big audiences and big theaters anytime soon because of the restrictions on the amount of people that you can have and social distancing. And I went to a movie theater last week, and there was 4 people in the whole theater. And so to your point, Rachel, I think what that's going to allow us to do is have these very intimate settings where theater is going to take place, where you can have very intimate conversations, where you could have this sense of well, let's really get into this. And what's important about that is that, because we're coming out of the pandemic, in a time where people were not talking to their loved ones, people were not able to go outside, people were not being able to socialize, people were able to kind of sit down and think about their social circles, think about racial equity issues, see our capital be attacked. I mean, there's just a lot of trauma, there's a lot of pain, and I think people are going to look for places to process that. And I think to the extent that theater is branching out outside of New York, outside of many different places, and theater is going to be a very, very intimate space, at least for the time being, maybe for the next year and a half, maybe it is going to be a good place to have these type of dialogues and to continue processing this in a very intimate way.
I'm a big believer, and this is from personal experience, I'm a big believer that there is collateral beauty in all catastrophe. And so as difficult as this pandemic has been, and as horrible as it is to have seen so many people die and get ill in the last year, I do think it is the perfect storm. I think that the world coming to a stop is what was needed for us to not be distracted long enough to be able to actually see what was going on, to start being accountable, to be having the courageous conversations, the important conversations that we need to have, for people to stop acting blind or deaf or dumb to things. And so I say that the pandemic had to happen in order for something that is long overdue but right on time, which is, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, violence against Asian Americans, all of these dialogues. It's the perfect storm that we need to, have a moment of reckoning with. I think this moment is about really pointing the flashlight in on ourselves and saying, what is my responsibility in all of this? What do I want this to look like, and how can I contribute to the world I want this to be?
There's a different awareness. In spite of my isolation in this room, I felt newly aware of things going on outside of this room. And my earnest hope, and also increasingly aware of how unaware I am, how much I have missed and I continue to miss. And so my great hope is that I can continue that expansion of connection and awareness. It's like being mindful of the whole world. It increased mindfulness and can take that, as Melissa says, well beyond. I have a starting point that is not where I was a year and a couple months ago, but somewhere that the theater, the relationships that I have any influence on can only be better and advanced. And I think my great fear is that we will go back to just where we were. I personally, but that you get the same rut, and that the world will embrace an old status quo. I hope that's impossible. I fear it might be possible, but I think it can't go back. And that's been the remarkable thing about continuing to produce some sort of theater event throughout all of this, has been finding new ways of connecting with people, new ways of understanding what theater is good for. And I hope we can continue that into the future.
I am mostly hopeful that even if we revert back to some things, and I have to say, when it comes to theater, alienating white audiences is a real thing. And part of the growth process is going to be returning to some things and trying other things. It's like sometimes, that's what it takes to get stronger. We won't be the same. We won't be the same because we're already different.
I just would like to thank everyone for joining us for this conversation. So many thoughts and feelings that have been, unearthed. I'm just really grateful for it, and I appreciate all of you. The conversation has just been illuminating. And so I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us from afar. We do plan to have more of these conversations and to have more of these shared thoughts and feelings at exploring our art and our history and our communities. So we hope that you'll stay tuned and join us. We also hope that you'll join us this Saturday for Bertha the Sewing Machine Girl by Charles Foster, the first in a special two-part event at the Metropolitan Virtual Playhouse, which will conclude the following Saturday. Thank you again, for all of our panelists and audience members. I appreciate you all. Be safe, be well, love one another.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Love one another.